I love it when research is presented as breaking news, when in reality, it's just confirming what the Bible has been teaching for thousands of years. For example, Time magazine broke the news story that men and women are different. I don't know if you can see the subtitle here, but it says, embrace yourself for this. It isn't just upbringing, new studies show. Thank goodness for new studies. They are born that way. Wow. I mean, you might ask, who knew? And then you think, oh yeah, that's in the book of Genesis, where it says God created every person, man and woman, in his image. And yet, he created them differently, distinctly. Or there's a more recent example, this from a woman named Louise Perry. She wrote a very popular and a widely read book called The Case Against the Sexual Revolution. Now, Louise Perry is a self-described British liberal feminist, but what she recognized through her work was that when you separate sex from marriage, not a good thing. Turns out it's not a good thing for society, it's not a good thing for men, but in her particular burden is to show that it is not a good thing at all for women. Now, she's not making so much a moral argument as much as a pragmatic one. She doesn't talk in terms of right and wrong as much as wise and foolish. She says she's not a Christian, but she thinks society should adopt the traditional Christian sexual ethic. I mean, who knew that if you separated sex from marriage, it wouldn't go so well? Oh, maybe your New Testament, right? Or have you heard the last few years that people are presenting this new studies that show that if you unplug from work, like a day a week, just unplug from work, you unplug from technology, and you spend that day around people who are refreshing and around doing things that are energizing, that unplugging one day a week is really good for you mentally, psychologically, emotionally, health-wise. And the Christians are all looking around going, are you people talking about the Sabbath, right? Like, that's all the way back in the book of Exodus. Or here's another study out in the last few years, this by University of California at Berkeley. I'll show you what they say are the benefits, and you see if you figure out what causes these benefits. They say the research shows, and not just from Berkeley, but lots of places, that if you practice this thing, you have less depression and anxiety. You have better and longer sleep, lower levels of systemic inflammation. I'm not sure what that is, but it sounds good. Higher levels of happiness and satisfaction. You're less prone to materialism and workplace burnout. If you just practice this thing, you'll become more resilient after traumatic events, more patient. You form better and stronger relationships. In fact, Scientific American went so far as to say that it is this thing here, like there's a lot of good things in life that'll help your well-being, but this is the single best predictor of well-being. Now, what is it that causes all these benefits and the single best predictor of well-being? Well, it's gratitude. Gratitude. And you might say, well, gosh, if I had a better life, I'd be more thankful. And that's the opposite of what's right. If you were more thankful, you would have a better life. That thankfulness is the root and the good life is the fruit. Well, who would have ever known that? Well, maybe Israel's prayer book. Maybe the book of Psalms knew that thousands of years ago. It is said, it is good to give thanks to the Lord, to sing praises to the Most High. Today, we will look at the classic story of thankfulness taught by Jesus in the Gospels. It starts in Luke chapter 17. Here's where we go. Luke 17, verse 11 says, now on his way to Jerusalem, Jesus traveled along the border between Samaria and Galilee. As he was going to a village, 10 men who had leprosy met him. Leprosy was a very debilitating and deadly disease. There was very little known about it in the first century. There for sure wasn't a cure. Leprosy was renamed Hansen's disease in 1873 because a man named Dr. Hansen discovered that leprosy was caused by a bacteria. So that was discovered in 1873, but a cure wasn't found until 1981. So for thousands of years, leprosy did a lot of damage, killed millions of people. The way you would notice it is you would have a rash or a wound that would just quite never heal. And this is the bacteria that was causing that, and it spread so that it caused neurological damage. But the first thing that you notice is that it caused damage in your extremities, your hands, your feet, that they would become contorted as the bacteria killed the cartilage inside of your body. Leprosy was incredibly deadly. It was very contagious. So not only were there health implications, but also religious ones. Like you were isolated religiously, you couldn't go to the temple, you couldn't go worship with other people. There was social isolation too. Because it was so contagious, you couldn't live inside of a community. The Old Testament gave very specific instructions on how a person with leprosy was expected to behave. This is all the way back in Leviticus 13. Anyone with such a defiling disease must wear torn clothes, let their hair be unkempt, cover the lower part of their face, and cry out, unclean, unclean. As long as they have the disease, they remain unclean. They must live alone. They must live outside the camp. So everyone with this skin disease that they referred to as leprosy was forced outside of the community, and therefore they lived in colonies. They became known as leper colonies. Now, we'll see in a few moments that there were Samaritans and Jews living together in this leper colony. And you probably know this, that Samaritan Jews, they hated one another. Like they would not live in the same place unless they had leprosy, and then they did. See, there's something about pain and suffering that causes you to overlook superficial things that just aren't that important, that kind of bind people together. But I hope you notice that Luke referred to these people as men. He didn't refer to them as 10 lepers, but 10 men. Because see, it's always wrong to reduce someone to a disease. The fact that these men had leprosy didn't rob them of being created in the image of God. In 1968, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. went to Memphis to march with the sanitation workers there. The protesters were upset because they wanted better working conditions. Two of their fellow workers had been crushed inside of a garbage truck. That's what led to the strike. That's what led to the marches. And when Dr. King went to Memphis, sadly, it was his last time to visit there because he was assassinated on that trip in 1968. But when he joined that march with those sanitation workers, they held up a sign that was the essence of their protest. And the sign just said, "I am a man." What they were saying is, look through the fact that I'm a sanitation worker, that I pick up your trash. Look through the fact that my race is different than you. Look through all the differences and see that at the core, I am a man. I think there's something we need to learn from that. We need to be careful when we hear ourselves saying 10 addicts, 10 homeless, 10 Republicans, 10 Democrats, 10 rich, 10 poor, 10 black, 10 white, 10 wheelchairs. No. I think we need to see 10 people. You never want to reduce people to just one thing about them, and you sure never want to reduce people to a label that society has put on them. They are not a label, they are people. And can we see past the label and see the human being that God made? Back to our story. They stood at a distance and called out in a loud voice, "Jesus, Master, have mercy on us." Now in the Gospels, the only people to use this term master to refer to Jesus are his disciples or his followers. And so what I think it's telling us is that these 10 men who have leprosy, they're beginning to understand, they're beginning to grasp how powerful Jesus is, his authority, his majesty. They get that he can do something about their condition. And they ask him to have mercy on them. See, they hear that not only is he approaching their village, but that he is approachable. Verse 14. When he saw them, he said, "Go show yourselves to the priests." Now, Jesus isn't sending these 10 men to the priests so that the priests can cure them of the leprosy. No, he's sending them to the priests so that the priests can verify that they no longer have leprosy. The priests didn't have any way to cure this disease, but instead they were functioning as kind of a medical examiner. If a person with leprosy thought they were getting better, if they thought that the leprosy had gone, then Leviticus 13 and 14 gave very specific instructions. They were to go to the priest. The priest was to examine them. And if they found that the leprosy was no longer there, then they could re-enter into society. So Jesus tells these 10 men, go to the priests, and you can see what they're thinking. Why would I do that? I have leprosy. And he says, go. See, what Jesus is doing is he's testing their faith. He's asking them to act as if they have been healed. Do you feel like right now Jesus is doing anything in your life to test your faith? That maybe he's given you an assignment that seems bigger than you can handle? See, faith isn't seeing the results and then praising God. Oftentimes, faith is praising God before we ever see the results. That's why Paul tells us in 2 Corinthians 5 that we live by faith, not by sight. So these 10 men with leprosy, they call Jesus master. In other words, they're saying, Jesus, we know that you are the one who speaks and calms the waves and the waters. You are the one who can speak and leprosy be cured. And now they have asked him for mercy. They haven't come to him saying, we are good people, we deserve this. They've come and said, you are a compassionate, merciful God. Would you heal us? And he says, I want you to act as if you've been healed. Go to the priests. Verse 14, as they went, they were cleansed. One of them, when he saw he was healed, came back praising God in a loud voice. He threw himself at Jesus' feet and thanked him, and he was a Samaritan. Jesus asked, were not all 10 cleansed? Where are the other 9? Has no one returned to give praise to God except this foreigner? Where are the other 9? 10 men experienced a miracle, and 9 went on their way, and 1 returned. 10 men saw their life changed, and 9 just kept going, and 1 went back to say thank you to Jesus. And when Jesus says, where are the other 9? The obvious implication is that they should be here thanking me too. Why aren't they? And now before you judge those 9 too harshly, recognize that they probably felt grateful, right? They probably felt grateful. They just didn't return to say thank you. They felt thankful, but they never expressed it. It's really important to know this truth, that the unexpressed gratitude is experienced as ingratitude. Unexpressed gratitude is experienced as ingratitude. So you might think, well, I feel grateful. I mean, God's done all kinds of good things to me. Yeah, I get it. I believe you. But gratitude is a feeling. Thankfulness is a habit. Your mom didn't teach you to feel thankful. She taught you to develop the practice, the habit of saying thank you. Doesn't it kind of bother you? Like if you do something for somebody, like you go out of your way, you spend extra time or money or something, and you do something for someone and they never even just say thanks? I mean, you wish it didn't bother you, I get it, but it does, doesn't it? Of course it does. But why do we do that to God? Jesus asked, where are the other 9? Where are the other 9? Why didn't they come back? And maybe that question gives us a chance to ask ourselves a question. Why don't we explicitly thank God more than we do? Why don't we thank God? That's the question, and I think the first reason is because thanking God is humbling. Thanking God reminds us that we are dependent on him. And gratitude is an admission of weakness. Gratitude says, I couldn't have done this on my own, thank you. James 1:16 says, don't be deceived. Don't be deceived, my dear brothers and sisters. Well, what is it that we might be deceived about? Well, he says, every good and perfect gift comes from above. It comes down from God your Father. See, you might be deceived, James says, into thinking that the good things in your life are from you, or from chance, or from circumstances, or from another person. Don't be deceived. Every good thing in your life comes from God. So when the Israelites were getting ready to go into the promised land, this land that God had set aside for them, had promised them, Moses says to the people in the book of Deuteronomy, he says in chapter 8, when you go into the promised land and have eaten and are satisfied, praise the Lord your God. When you go into the promised land and things are good, thank the Lord your God for the good land he has given you. It is a gift. And then he goes on in verse 12 and he says, otherwise, like if you don't stop and thank God for all the good things he's given you, if you don't do that, When you eat and are satisfied, and when you build fine houses and settle down, and when your herds and flocks grow large, and your silver and gold increase, and all you have is multiplied, like when things go really well and life is good, if you haven't thanked God, explicitly thanked God for all that he's given you, it's a gift, then your heart is gonna become proud. And you're gonna forget the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt in the land of slavery. He goes on and says, you may say to yourself, like you may be so deceived, you may be so foolish as to say to yourself, my power and the strength of my hands have produced this wealth for me. He goes, what a fool you would be if you thought that it was you who got the good things in your life. Remember the Lord your God, for it is he who gives you the ability to produce wealth. It's he who gives you the ability to work hard. It's he who gives you the ability to be smart. It's he who gives you the ability to do all the good things in your life. He doesn't just give you the good gifts, he gives you the ability to produce them. Paul asked this really humbling question in 1 Corinthians 4. What do you have that God hasn't given you? Just make a list. Start making the list. Like I'm sure it's gonna be a really long list, right? What do you have that God hasn't given you? I mean, Moses is just taking everything away because he says not only has God given you all the gifts, but God gave you the ability to work hard. God gave you the smarts. God gave you the family you grew up in. God gave you that you're good at a certain profession that society values, that earns money. God has given you the friends in your life, the network, the people who've helped you along the way. God put you in a secure home. He gave you every single thing. So what are you going to put on this list that you have that God didn't give you? And I would suggest nothing. And so it goes on to say, what do you have that God hasn't given you? And if everything you has is from God, then why boast as if we're not a gift? Why act like it's not a gift? So why don't we thank God then? Why are we off with the other 9? Well, it's not just that it's humbling, it's also that we think we're deserving. See, Luke made a big deal to point out that the one who went back, the one person who was healed, that went back and thanked Jesus was a Samaritan. And then do you remember what Jesus called him? Jesus said, where are the other 9? How come the only one that's come back is a foreigner? Like they're signaling something. There's a big deal here. What is it? Well, first it means that the other 9 were most likely Jews. They weren't Samaritans. They weren't a foreigner. Remember, Samaritans were half Jew, half Gentile, and there's this hated rivalry between the two. The Jews looked down on the Samaritans. And so I think what the point is that this one who came back to say thanks, he was an outcast twice. An outcast because he was a Samaritan and had been pushed aside and looked down on, and an outcast because he had leprosy. And I think the implication is that maybe these other 9, they were the insiders. They were Jews. They had the power. And maybe they started to think that they deserved to be healed. Like they didn't go back and say thank you explicitly to Jesus because they kind of, well, you know, I kind of do deserve it. I am pretty good. So maybe I don't have to say thanks because some of this is me. See, the lack of thankfulness reveals an entitlement. An entitled attitude, an attitude that says, I deserve good things. And that's dangerous. I don't know if you know this man, his name's Stephen Hawking. He's a brilliant mathematician and physicist. He died a few years ago. At age 21, he developed a motor neuron disease. So by this time, he had already completed a lot of academic work, but he continued to work after his disease. It slowly decayed his body. He wasn't even able to speak near the end of his life. They asked him, how do you keep your spirits up? And here's what Stephen Hawking, not a Christian, in fact, I'm pretty sure an atheist, my expectations were reduced to 0 when I was 21. Everything since then has been a bonus. Well, that's a good way to look at life. My expectations were reduced to 0. Everything else has been a bonus. I mean, what if we as Christians kind of took that attitude and put it into our belief system? Wouldn't we say that as Christians, we believe that everything we have is a matter of God's grace, that what we deserved was punishment, what we deserve is God's wrath. So that means every good thing in our life, small, big, recent, something in the past, it's all undeserved, and therefore we should be thankful for it because it's all a gift. Why don't we thank God, humbling, deserving, and we take it for granted? We take God's gifts for granted. Let's say there's a CEO, we'll just say he's a guy, and you ask him, who's the most important person in your life? And he's like, well, my vice president of sales. They go, what about your wife? Oh, yeah, of course. I mean, I just assumed, yeah, of course she is. I just didn't say anything. What we say, he's taking her for granted. Like, to take something for granted means to give little attention to it, to underestimate the value, to fail to appreciate it. And it's possible to take really important things for granted. You and I, we take oxygen for granted, right? We take it for granted our car will start in the morning. Many of us take our health for granted. And almost all of us take God's gifts for granted. Don't you just kind of take it for granted? That's why you don't say thank you. You've gotten so used to it. Psalm 107, it doesn't say, take the Lord for granted, for he is good and his love endures forever. No, Psalm 107 says, give thanks to the Lord, for he is good, and his love endures forever. Because you know, no spouse is honored by being taken for granted. No spouse is honored by being assumed, and neither is God. God is honored when we take time to explicitly say, thank you for this good gift you've brought in my life. Is expressing gratitude difficult for you? Are you better at finding fault, like how something could be better, than you are of saying thanks for how good God has given you? How do you cultivate a thankful spirit, a thankful attitude? Well, let's start with a story. It's a story that comes to us from kind of the Yiddish perspective. The title of the story is, It Could Always Be Worse. And the story, as it is told, is about a poor man who lives with his 6 kids, his wife, and his mother-in-law, and they live in a really smart hut. They're a poor family, and he's just tired of all the noise and all the crowdedness, and so he's at his wit's end, and he goes to his rabbi, and he says, Rabbi, I just can't do it anymore. It's loud, it's obnoxious, it's tight. I'm poor, I can't afford anything more. Help me. And the rabbi thinks for a little bit, and he goes, do you have any animals? And the guy's like, well, yeah. He goes, you got some chickens? I got a couple chickens. He goes, take them inside, put it inside the house. And he goes, what? That's weird, but I always do what the rabbi tells me. So he goes home and he takes the chickens and he puts them inside the house, and they're squawking and they're doing all their thing, and they're loud and obnoxious, and now it's even more crowded. And he's like, I can't do it anymore, I can't do it. He goes back to the rabbi and says, Rabbi, help, I need help. I can't do it. Chickens aren't helping. He goes, you got a goat? Well, I'm poor, but I do have a goat. He goes, put it in the house. And he goes, what, this is nuts. He goes back, he gets the goat, he brings it, he puts it in the house, and now it's even worse than it was before. So he goes back to the rabbi again. Rabbi, this is driving me nuts. And the rabbi goes, I heard you have a cow. A cow? Yeah, I do have a cow. Put the cow inside with you. So the guy goes home, because he always does what the rabbi says. He takes the cow, put it in there. Well, the cow's huge. The cow's breaking things. There's cow patties everywhere. It's noisy, and he's just losing it. So he goes back to the rabbi, utterly desperate, utterly frustrated, at his wit's end, and says, Rabbi, I can't do it anymore. And he goes, okay, go home and let all the animals out of the house. And the guy did, and the nightmare was over. He lived at peace in his cozy little house with his family. Now, I'm sure you get the point, right? I mean, the title, It Could Always Be Worse, kind of gives it away. But no matter what you're going through, no matter where you are in life, what the story is teaching us is that it could always be worse. There's a lot to be thankful for. You see the good in whatever it is you have? See, that's the key question, is can you look at do you look at a good thing and find out the bad? Like, this is good, but it could be better. Like, that's your spiritual gift, is critiquing it and how to make things better? Or do you look at stuff that's pretty hard and start to find the good? Like, it could be small things. Like, this kitchen is a mess. I'm not thankful that I have to clean it up. But I am thankful that I have friends and family that were at my house sharing this together. Or small things, again, like taxes. I'm not thankful that I have to pay taxes, but I am thankful for a job, because that means that I can provide for myself and my family. Sometimes it's bigger things. Like, God, I'm not thankful that I'm stuck in my career. It's hard to be here. It's not where I plan to be. But I am thankful that it's caused me to reevaluate my priorities. Or, God, I'm not thankful for this cancer that you brought in my life, but I can see the good, and I can be thankful for the way you've drawn our family together. Are you a person that sees good things and finds bad in it? Are you a person that goes through hard things, but starts to have the eyes of faith to see the good and be thankful for it? Third, there's this expression called dayenu. I'm probably mispronouncing it, but I think that's it. People were making fun of me after the first service. And it's a Hebrew word. It just means it would be enough. It would have been enough. And the Jews, when they came out of Israel, they celebrated Passover. When they came out of Egypt, they celebrated Passover, how God delivered them from the Egyptians in slavery there. And as part of the Passover meal, they would say dayenu. It would have been enough. And they recounted all the ways that God had been good to them, bringing them out of Egypt. Like they said, God delivered us from Egypt. And even if he had done that, but not given us the wealth of the Egyptians, it would have been enough. But he did give us the wealth of the Egyptians, and that would have been enough. But you know what he did? He went further, and he split the Red Sea so we could walk through on dry ground, and that would have been enough. But he went further, and he gave us Torah, the law to live by, and that would have been enough. Dayenu, it would have been enough, but God went further, and he gave us more. He gave us the promised land. What if we had that word, dayenu? It would have been enough. And we practiced that in our life. Like we looked at our life and we said, God, you have been good to us. You could have just given us a family, and that would have been enough, but you did more. You gave us friendships, people in our life that we're friends with, and that would have been enough. But you gave us marriage, you gave us kids, you gave us a job, that would have been enough. But you gave us fun things to do, but that would have been enough. You put a roof over our head, you gave us the opportunity to go on vacations and see different places. Dayenu, that would have been enough. But God went further. God sent his son. He went to the cross. He died for us so that we could be forgiven. He gave us eternal life. That would have been enough, but God did more. He put us in a church so that we could worship together and be in a small group and build friendships and encourage one another. Dayenu, that would have been enough, but God always goes further because he always does more than we deserve. What are you thankful for? What do you want to say thanks to God for today? When you came in, you were given a card. Would you just take it out? We're not going to leave things assumed. We're not going to take God for granted today, but we are going to say thank you. We're not going to just assume that God's goodness. We're not going to think we deserve it. We're going to humble ourselves before him and say, God, thank you for this. Did you just write down something that you're thankful for? I'm sure there's been something that God's brought to your mind as you've sat here and listened to this story. When he said, where are the other 9? We're not going with them. Not today, not here, not now. We're going with the one, and we're going back to Jesus to say thank you. Just write something you're thankful for. While you do that, I just want to tell you that every Sunday, if there's something you want to pray about, maybe something you're thankful for, you can go right over here to my right, your left, like next to that wall, next to the stairs. There's people there who would love to thank God with you for whatever you're experiencing, but who also would love to pray for whatever trial or challenge you're going through. Hopefully you've written down something you're thankful for. When you leave, go put it on the boards outside, or can't all do that at one time. So there are people standing back there. If you want to hand it to them, they'd be happy to put it on the board for you. But today, here, now, we're going to thank the Lord and let him know that we appreciate all that he has given us. Let's pray. Father, you have been good to us. You have done more than enough to people who deserved nothing. Father, I pray you would make in us a thankful people. It's in your name we pray. Amen.